A cold wind howled through the trees, rattling the windows of an old wooden cabin that stood alone at the edge of the forest. Rain poured down in thick sheets, drumming against the roof as thunder rumbled in the distance. Inside the dimly lit cabin, an elderly man sat by the fire, his gnarled hands cupped around a steaming mug of tea. His name was Walter, a quiet man who had spent most of his years in solitude, save for one unlikely companion, a lame crow. Walter had found the bird months ago, struggling in the mud with an injured wing. Most would have walked past without a second thought, but something about the helpless creature stirred something deep inside him. Every day since, no matter the weather, Walter had stepped outside to feed the crow. He would scatter bits of bread and scraps of meat on the wooden railing of his porch, watching as the bird hobbled over, its dark eyes filled with an intelligence he couldn't quite explain. Over time, a strange bond formed between them. The crow never let him get too close, but it always came back, waiting patiently for its daily meal. That night, however, something felt different. Walter pulled his coat tighter around his frail body as he stepped onto the porch, braving the storm to leave food in the usual spot. The wind nearly knocked him off balance, and the rain soaked through his clothes in seconds. He whistled, a low, familiar sound the crow had come to recognize, but the bird did not come. Walter frowned, glancing toward the towering trees where it often perched. Nothing. Only the roar of the storm and the flickering of the lantern he had set outside. For the first time in months, the crow was nowhere to be seen. A strange unease settled in Walter's chest as he lingered for a moment longer before retreating inside. He dried himself off by the fire, telling himself that the bird had simply found shelter somewhere. But deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Hours passed, and the storm only grew stronger. The wind howled like a wounded beast, and rain lashed against the windows with relentless force. Walter sat in his chair, dozing off now and then, until a sudden noise jolted him awake, a sharp tapping at the window. His heart pounded as he turned his head toward the sound. There, just beyond the glass, was the crow. But it wasn't alone. Lightning flashed, illuminating the dark, twisted figures perched beside it. More crows, dozens of them, clinging to the window frame and the surrounding trees, their eyes gleaming in the stormy night. Walter's breath caught in his throat as he slowly stood, drawn toward the eerie sight. The lame crow flapped its wings weakly, as if urging him to come closer. And then, through the chaos of the storm, Walter saw it. Something gripped tightly in the crow's beak. Something small, glinting in the dim light. A strange and unexpected gift. But why? And where had all these birds come from? Walter's fingers trembled as he reached for the latch. Whatever was about to happen next, he had the unsettling feeling that his quiet, lonely life would never be the same again. Walter hesitated, his fingers hovering over the window latch. The storm raged on outside, the wind pushing against the cabin as if trying to force its way in. The crows remained still, their dark forms barely moving despite the gusts of wind whipping through the trees. Only the lame crow stirred, shifting its weight as it gripped the mysterious object in its beak. His heart pounded as he unlatched the window and eased it open. The wind rushed inside, carrying the scent of damp earth and pine. The lame crow hopped onto the windowsill, tilting its head as if studying him. Walter's eyes fell to the small object clutched in its beak, something metallic, glinting even in the dim firelight. It wasn't just a scrap of debris or some odd trinket. It was a ring. Walter's breath caught. He recognized it instantly. The simple gold band, worn and scratched by time. His late wife's wedding ring. The very same one that had been lost years ago, vanished without a trace after she passed. He had searched everywhere, torn through drawers, overturned furniture, even checked outside, though he knew she'd never have left it there. And yet, here it was, clasped gently in the beak of a bird. His fingers trembled as he reached for it, but the crow didn't let go. Instead, it gave a low caw, its black eyes locked onto his. The other crows shifted, rustling their feathers in eerie unison. A strange sensation crawled up Walter's spine. This wasn't a coincidence. It couldn't be. Where? Where did you find this? He whispered, feeling foolish for speaking to a bird, but unable to stop himself. The lame crow finally released the ring, dropping it into his palm before hopping back onto the windowsill. Walter turned it over between his fingers, his mind racing. The weight of it, the familiar nicks and scratches. It was real, but how? His thoughts were interrupted by another sound. A rustling, low and steady, coming from the trees beyond the cabin. Walter peered into the darkness, his pulse quickening. Shadows shifted between the trunks, shapes moving where there should be none. The crows on the branches turned their heads in perfect sync, as if watching something approach. A gust of wind slammed against the cabin, making the window shutters rattle. The lame crow let out a sharp cry, then lifted off, disappearing into the night. One by one, the others followed, vanishing into the storm as quickly as they had appeared. Walter was left alone, clutching the ring, his breath shallow. And then, from the depths of the forest, he heard it. A voice. Faint, almost drowned out by the wind. A whisper that sent a chill through his bones. It called his name. Walter's breath hitched. He stood frozen by the open window, gripping the ring as though it might slip away like a fading memory. The voice, soft, distant, almost drowned by the storm, had unmistakably called his name. It wasn't the wind playing tricks, nor the creak of the trees bending under the rain. It was real. He turned toward the forest, his eyes scanning the dark, shifting shadows between the trunks. The fire inside the cabin cast flickering light onto the porch, but beyond that, the night swallowed everything. He felt a pull, something deep in his gut, an instinct he couldn't ignore. The same feeling that had made him stop for the injured crow all those months ago. His mind raced, trying to make sense of it all. The ring, the crows, the voice. It was impossible. But then again, life had been strange ever since his wife passed. He had spent years in quiet grief, speaking to her in the stillness of his cabin, imagining her presence in the whisper of the wind. Was this some cruel trick of the storm, or something else entirely? A sharp rustling from the trees made him tense. A shadow moved, too large for a bird, too quick for the wind. He strained his ears, waiting, but the night held its breath. Then another whisper, this time closer. Walter! The sound wrapped around him, familiar yet impossible. His legs felt heavy, but his hands burned with the cold metal of the ring. The crows had brought something back to him. But was it a gift or a warning? Walter's pulse pounded in his ears. The storm had not let up, but now it felt distant, like a backdrop to something far more unsettling. The voice had called his name again, closer this time, just beyond the trees. His grip on the ring tightened, the familiar weight grounding him in the midst of the growing unease. Lightning flashed, illuminating the forest for a brief moment. Walter's breath caught. A figure stood between the trees, barely visible through the heavy rain. It wasn't moving, just standing there, watching. The firelight from the cabin didn't reach far enough to make out any features, but the silhouette was unmistakably human. He took a step forward, his boots sinking into the wet ground. The crows had vanished into the night, their presence replaced by an unnatural stillness. Even the wind seemed to hold back, as if waiting. Walter's throat felt dry. His mind screamed at him to turn away, to go inside and lock the door. But something deeper, something unshakable, urged him on. The figure shifted, not walking, not stepping forward, but gliding, almost as if the earth itself moved beneath its feet. Walter's heart slammed against his ribs. This was wrong. Every instinct in his body told him he should not be seeing this. Then the whisper came again, curling through the air like smoke. "Walter, you forgot me." His breath caught. The voice, it wasn't just familiar, It was hers, his wife's. The storm surged again, wind roaring through the trees. The figure took another step, finally emerging from the shadows. Walter's world tilted. He stumbled back, his pulse a wild drumbeat in his ears. This couldn't be real. And yet, she was standing right in front of him. Walter's breath came in short, uneven gasps. The figure before him was impossibly familiar. The curve of her shoulders, the way the wind barely seemed to touch her, the presence that made his chest tighten with an emotion he couldn't name. But it wasn't possible. His wife was gone. He had buried her. And yet, here she was, standing in the rain, watching him with dark, searching eyes. His mind raced for an explanation. Was this some cruel trick? Had grief finally unraveled him after all these lonely years? He squeezed the ring in his palm, its cold weight pressing into his skin, grounding him. The crows had brought it back. But why? And how could it have led to this? Lightning split the sky again, and for the briefest moment, Walter swore he saw something strange. Her shadow, or rather the absence of one. The light hit her, but the ground beneath remained undisturbed. The air thickened with an unnatural stillness. "Why did you leave me?" The voice was soft, just as he remembered, but layered with something else. Something that didn't belong. It sent a chill straight to his bones. Walter opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. The wind howled, the trees shuddered, and then movement. From the corners of his vision, the crows returned, perching on branches, the rooftop, even the porch railing. Dozens of them, watching, waiting. The lame crow was among them, its beady eyes locked onto Walter, as if urging him to act. Then, before he could react, the figure took another step closer. The firelight flickered wildly, the flames bending toward her instead of away. His chest tightened, his hands trembling as the truth pressed down on him. This was not his wife. The moment the realization hit, the wind surged again, sending the door of the cabin swinging open with a deafening crack. Walter stumbled back, his foot catching on the threshold. He barely managed to stay upright as the air inside the cabin turned ice cold. The figure stood just outside now, still watching. The crows began to cry out, their voices rising in a chaotic chorus. The lame crow, the one that had returned to him night after night, let out a sharp, desperate call before launching itself toward the figure. The figure didn't move, didn't flinch. Instead, as the bird reached her, it was as if the storm itself swallowed them both. A gust of wind stronger than anything before sent Walter crashing to the ground. When he looked up again, she was gone. But the ring in his hand was warm now, as if it had just been touched. Walter lay on the wet ground, his chest rising and falling in ragged breaths. The wind had died down, the storm retreating as suddenly as it had come. The crows were gone. The trees stood still, their branches heavy with rain. And the figure, his wife or whatever it had been, had vanished. His fingers curled around the ring, now strangely warm against his skin. He pushed himself up, his body aching, his mind a whirlwind of confusion and fear. He turned toward the cabin, its door still wide open, the fire inside flickering weakly. Everything was as it had been before the storm, but nothing felt the same. Walter stepped inside, closing the door behind him. He needed answers. He needed to understand what had just happened. His hands shook as he placed the ring on the wooden table. Had the crows brought it back to warn him, or had they led him to something he was never meant to see? A creaking sound made him turn sharply. The old rocking chair by the fireplace, his wife's favourite place to sit, moved slightly, as if someone had just risen from it. His breath caught. The air in the cabin was no longer cold, but heavy with something unseen. A presence. Then a whisper. Soft, almost tender. "You remember now." Walter's blood ran cold. His reflection in the window caught his eye, and his heart slammed against his ribs. The chair wasn't empty. She was sitting there. Not the eerie figure from before, but her, as she had been, her kind eyes, her gentle smile. But something in her expression made his stomach tighten. Not sorrow, not anger, something else. Understanding. Memories, long buried, surfaced in his mind. The day she died, the way he had searched for the ring, how he had torn the house apart in grief, convinced she had left it somewhere. But now a terrible truth unfolded before him. He hadn't lost it, he had hidden it. And in doing so, he had hidden something else, a secret buried so deep even he had forgotten. Until now. Walter's breath came in shaky gasps as he turned back to the table. The ring sat there, perfectly still. But beside it, where nothing had been before, was a single black feather. The crows had not just come to return what was lost, they had come to make him remember. Walter stared at the black feather beside the ring, his mind spinning. The cabin felt unbearably silent now, the air thick with something he couldn't name. The fire crackled softly, casting shifting shadows along the wooden walls, but he barely noticed. His eyes remained locked on the objects before him, one from his past, the other a message from something far beyond his understanding. He swallowed hard. His hands trembled as he reached for the feather, the delicate thing weightless between his fingers. A memory stirred, faint at first, then sharp as a blade. He had hidden the ring, not out of forgetfulness, not out of grief, but out of guilt. The night his wife passed, they had argued. Not a loud fight, not one full of anger, but something deeper. She had been sick for a long time, and he had struggled to accept the inevitable. She had tried to comfort him, but he had turned away, unable to face the truth. The last words he had said to her were ones of frustration, not love. That night she had gone to bed alone, her wedding ring left on the table beside her. By morning, she was gone. The guilt had consumed him. He couldn't bear to look at the ring, a reminder of the love he had failed to show in her final hours. So he had taken it, hidden it away where even he couldn't find it, convincing himself it had been lost. And with time, he had almost believed it. But the crows had remembered. They had watched. They had waited. Walter let out a long, shuddering breath. He turned back toward the rocking chair, but it was empty now. No trace of her remained, only the warmth in the room, as if she had finally found peace. Slowly, he picked up the ring, turning it over in his palm. It no longer felt heavy. The weight of his guilt, his grief. It was still there, but different now. Lighter. The storm had passed. Outside, the wind had softened, the trees no longer groaning under its force. A faint caw echoed in the distance. Walter stepped onto the porch, the night air cool against his skin. The crows were perched in the branches, silent and still, their dark eyes watching him. He looked down at the ring one last time before slipping it onto his finger. "Thank you," he whispered. The lame crow gave a single nod before spreading its wings and disappearing into the night. One by one, the others followed, vanishing into the darkness. Walter stood there for a long time, listening to the quiet hum of the world around him. And for the first time in years, he did not feel alone.